Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Upon arriving for dinner at the groom's parents' house, the orphaned bride froze at the sight of a photo of her deceased mother on the living room wall. However, the main surprise awaited her ahead. Sandra opened her eyes. The same gray ceiling loomed above her as it had many times before, but now Sandra stared at it intently as if expecting to see some changes. There were none, of course, and Sandra sighed heavily, sat up in bed, and rubbed her face forcefully with her hands. For the past few weeks, lines from a song had been playing in her head constantly. The month will be long, only angry wolves around, and you are a lost lamb, running scared. This echoed the gray, cold morning when she had to get up and crawl to work. That's exactly how Sandra felt. Every morning seemed harder than the last, even grayer and colder, despite March having already begun, surprising the city's residents with unexpectedly warm weather. Sandra got out of bed, slipped her feet into slippers, and shuffled towards the bathroom. She, if it could be said, was luckier than most graduates. She didn't just get a small room in some apartment, but her own studio apartment. This apartment, however, only had 12 square meters of living space, but Sandra didn't like to complain about her fate. After all, better a small fish than an empty dish, and at least it was her own place, with no neighbors except for a cat that occasionally climbed onto the wide windowsill from outside. In the bathroom, a tired, gaunt girl looked back at her from the mirror. Sandra took a deep breath, bent over to wash her face, and tried to make her tired reflection look somewhat presentable. Alejandra Poland, who both she and some friends simply called Sandra, was a pretty 22-year-old woman. Slender, not very tall, perhaps even beautiful, with fair skin, large brown eyes, and a mane of long, wavy, jet-black hair she almost always tied in a high, thin ponytail. Her eyebrows were plucked into thin lines at the edges, and her fingers were similarly thin with sharply pointed nails. She had been working completely alone for several weeks, sleeping poorly and eating even worse, which had left dark circles under her eyes and her cheeks hollowed, giving her sharp, high cheekbones. In this witch-like appearance, she seemed more Alejandra than Sandra. But this name stubbornly refused to apply to her in her own mind. "Well, it's nothing," Sandra muttered, applying concealer under her eyes. "Nothing, soon it's vacation." Sandra worked at the pickup point of a well-known online store, and if anyone in her circle or some new acquaintances might scoff, what's there to get tired of? You just sit there and sit, occasionally clicking that scanner and handing over orders. In her current state, Sandra was ready to bite such a speaker right in the throat. Yeah, sure, clicking, and besides that, constantly keeping the place clean, damn it, and the pickup point in the warehouse, receiving and loading goods into the database. And all this almost without leaving the confined space from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. You could get claustrophobia, go crazy in that time. Moreover, working with people in any capacity was often harmful and difficult, a real nerve-wracker. Usually, Sandra didn't work so much, but her co-worker, Leonora, a young mother with a child, had always tried to work as much as possible. However, she and her child caught chickenpox and fell ill. So for the past week, Sandra had been working alone, doing all the work herself. The only consolation was that the manager of the pickup point was an understanding person and promised Sandra an unscheduled vacation as soon as Leonora could return from her sick leave. Leonora earnestly promised to make up for everything and give Sandra a break, as she too was not happy about the prolonged sick leave. Leonora's doctor gave a hopeful prognosis and promised that soon she would return to work and her son would go back to daycare. Today was Wednesday, so there were only 4 days left to endure, not counting today. Thus, with thoughts of the upcoming vacation and plans of what she could do, Sandra spent the whole morning getting ready for work. She had coffee with a sandwich, dressed, and left the house. It was still quite early, but there were already many people outside. Some were rushing to school, some, like her, to work. But every morning, regardless of what time it started for Sandra, whether at 7 a.m. or noon, no matter her mood, the weather, or any other factors of her morning or day, this moment would come. This exciting, tender, and trembling moment when Sandra, having climbed the steps to her office, would stop and glance over her shoulder. Her heart would stop as if seeing a loved one, and her breath would catch involuntarily. She savored these feelings for a whole minute before turning her back on the object of her adoration and getting back to her routine. Alejandra was not an architect. She had a mathematical mindset, leaned more towards music and perhaps good contemporary literature, but she couldn't distinguish between Baroque and Rococo or identify the shape of a church dome. Even the layout of apartments, while distinguishable, didn't have specific names in her mind. But she could recognize this building even in her sleep, could draw it with her eyes closed. Opposite her workplace, so that Sandra could see it through the glass doors even from her desk, stood the conservatory. The Madrid Conservatory, Spain's leading higher educational institution in the field of music, was founded in 1830 by royal decree and originally located on Montes Square in Madrid. It was later moved to the Royal Opera House until the building was demolished by royal order. Since 1990, the conservatory has been officially housed in a restored 18th century building opposite the Queen Sofia Museum. Yes, Sandra was not an architect, but she could recite this information even if woken up in the middle of the night. She knew it like a long-forgotten prayer. For Sandra, the conservatory was a beautiful castle in the clouds. An airy palace, a cherished magical place where one would want to be but couldn't reach. And yet, there it was, a very real, very tangible conservatory, with walls made of stone and concrete, not air. There it stood, across the road, just cross, enter. But for Sandra, it was indeed easier to fly to the clouds and touch them than to be on the other side of the beautiful conservatory's doors. But even if that was the case, she had these moments of admiring the conservatory, moments when she dreamed of being on the other side of those doors. Yeah, it's easier to breathe in these tiny droplets of water and ice crystals than to get into the conservatory. And they say money doesn't solve anything, Sandra muttered to herself and chuckled. And she fell silent. Her laughter dissipated into the room and faded away. Sandra listened intently to the echoes, then shook her head. She had indeed been working so hard that she was talking to herself and laughing at her own jokes. She definitely needed a vacation. Nevertheless, the workday began. Alejandra tidied up a bit, checked the merchandise, loaded the system, and opened the pickup point exactly at 8:59 a.m. The pickup point was located in an area with few residential buildings nearby, but during lunch and after 6 to 7 p.m., many students and teachers came to pick up their orders. Exhausted from their day, they could only drag themselves to collect their items and then head home. As Sandra expected, only 3 or 4 people came in during the first half of the day. They lived in the houses about 10 minutes away from the pickup point and were more inclined to take a walk rather than just go somewhere. Perhaps, some teenagers ordered something particularly curious and feared the contents of their orders might appear on the screen, causing the pickup operator to give them a judgmental look. Nothing special happened. Before the conservatory released its students, she tidied up again, mopped the floors, and started waiting. The hours when conservatory students came to the pickup point were the best and simultaneously the hardest for Alejandra. The pickup point manager had a teenage child and lamented the lack of a place for them to sit comfortably. So, a few benches were set up near the pickup point for the teenagers to sit, smoke, and chat. The windows of the pickup point overlooked these benches, and when Sandra opened them to air out the room, she could hear most of their conversations. This was, in essence, the burden and joy of those hours allotted to the students for lunch. We were going over the libretto almost until midnight. I seriously told Senora Lobato that it would be easier for us to stay overnight at the conservatory. I finally played the difficult part without a mistake. I was so proud of myself I thought the teacher would kiss me. The violin died faster than me. I wanted to get through it with this friend, but I had to switch to flight 134. Not that I'm complaining. I signed up for a meeting with directors in the masterclass format, eagerly awaiting the weekend. Sandra understood everything from these conversations. Every word, every term was familiar to her. Whatever she was doing at that moment, she listened to them with the eagerness of a collector admiring rare items for their collection, true treasures. Not being part of their art, Sandra intensely gathered any information she could about the place she longed to be, her beautiful castle in the clouds. When she listened, she felt as if she belonged to this wonderful world of musical art, a part of which she so desperately wanted to be. And when she pondered their conversations, imagining what she could respond, what she could add, she was truly happy. But when the rush hour passed, and the students returned to their classes, Sandra would clean up and go to lunch, and a heavy sadness and longing would wash over her. She felt like Scarlett O'Hara, a young, beautiful woman clad in the mourning clothes of a widow, watching others' merriment. Although she knew every move of every dance, stepping into the circle of dancers was not permissible for her. Finally, she finished her duties, sat down to have tea with pastries. And when the bell rang again, and a young man rushed into the room, he exclaimed, "Sorry," he rattled off. "Skipping classes?" Sandra asked, smiling involuntarily. She knew many of the conservatory students by face, and some even knew her by name, but this guy was special. "I have several assessments today, but they gave me automatic credits, and I got permission to leave to finish my thesis," he exhaled. "Besides, from 12 to 1:30 p.m., it's usually so crowded here, and I wanted to enjoy my purchases in peace." He tapped out the rhythm of the famous "We Will Rock You" on the counter. Sandra smiled and, pointing the barcode scanner at him, clicked it invitingly. Montes Claros was a graduate of the directing department and was planning to become a musical ballet director. He came from a rather well-off, even famous family. His mother was a well-known piano teacher and tutor, and his father was a lead dancer in the ballet. The Montes family was connected to both music and ballet, and his grandmother even sang in the opera. According to family chronicles, his great-grandmother or even great-great-grandmother organized concerts during the war years. All this information was readily available, and Sandra had thoroughly studied it, feeling an involuntary thrill from realizing she was interacting with someone so close to the cherished world of ethereal clouds. But Montes was not just the son of wealthy parents. From rare conversations with him, Sandra knew that the young heir of the Claros dynasty was determined, smart, and most importantly, genuinely in love with what he did. He was passionate about his directing work, diligent in his studies, even though his parents' name already opened all the doors he could wish to open. Sandra, who considered herself a hardworking and stubborn person, appreciated people who were just like her. Sometimes, listening to the students' conversations, she would clench her teeth and purse her lips. Brazen and arrogant, she thought, even if she later felt ashamed of those thoughts. It seems as if they've never had any hard knocks in life. And she was right, of course. Most of these carefree boys and girls had spent their entire lives in love, care, and well-being. And Montes, besides his outstanding personal qualities, was also a handsome man. He reminded her of the Starboy from the eponymous fairy tale, tall, with a fair and delicate face, as if carved from ivory, his golden curls like daffodil petals, lips like the petals of a red rose, eyes like aquamarines reflected in the clear water of a stream, and he was as slender as a flower growing in thick grass where no scythe had tread. Such comparisons came to Sandra's mind whenever she saw him, a true prince of royal blood, though Montes was indeed the heir of a renowned artistic dynasty. "Oh, here she is, the woman of my dreams," Montes purred, slowly pulling a thick black violin case out of the box. "And what more could a man need for complete happiness?" "Indeed," Sandra snorted ironically but looked at the case with interest. "Is it a Jua?" "A form-holding case with a lid secured by screws and an outer pocket for sheet music. It also comes with a carrying strap for the instrument," Montes nodded, lovingly stroking the violin case. If he treats the case this way, how does he react to his violin? Sandra thought. When I look at violins, I feel like that wizard from Harry Potter who sold magic wands. Long, 28 centimeters, Hollywood with a phoenix feather core. I described each of my violins to my mom the same way. If it's a Jua, then I assume it has a solid spruce top, maple back, the edge finished with protective inlay. The fingerboard and pegs are made of high-quality seasoned hardwood, and the body is covered with dark, reddish-brown varnish. The ergonomic bow is made of Brazil wood, with an ebony frog. Sandra just giggled. Montes raised an eyebrow in surprise, and his eyes shone with silent admiration. He slowly nodded. I see I'm not the only Ollivander, master of wands here. You know your stuff. In theory, Sandra nodded, not wanting to delve into details. Why do you need a violin if you're a director? I play, Montes said proudly and looked at Sandra with a new expression, mainly for myself, of course, but sometimes I compose music for my productions. Music helps me relax, and in my family, not being able to play at least one musical instrument is considered bad form. They declare me adopted. Sandra smiled, feeling a warm envy towards him. How wonderful it was to have the opportunity to do what you genuinely love, to develop in any direction you desire. But for her, no matter how hard she worked, she had to support herself, maintain her apartment, feed, and clothe herself. Alejandra could work herself to death, but she would never save enough for her education. She was saving something, still hoping for a better future, but each passing month made her realize that she couldn't study and work simultaneously, no matter how much she wanted to. Are you studying at a music school? Montes suddenly asked, putting the case back, and instead of leaving, leaned his hip against the inspection table and looked at Alejandra. No, Sandra shook her head. I only have time to work. I thought you were a musician, noticed you know a lot in theory. Sandra blushed. She and Montes had known each other for years since Alejandra was transferred from one pickup point to this one. It was closer to her home, and because it was recently opened, the pay was slightly higher. Well, to be precise, they were acquainted because Montes had been her last customer on the day when all humanity seemed to go off the rails, and all the customers coming for their packages were unreasonable. Alejandra, fortunately, had become tough from this kind of work with people, but she was morally exhausted. So, when a young man rushed into the room 10 minutes before closing, she didn't expect anything good and looked at him rather warily. Sorry, he rattled off, evidently mistaking her displeasure for a sign that Sandra wanted to leave early that day. I'll be quick, I need my sheet music notebooks, or else they'll tear me apart for not having them tomorrow. Since then, Montes often picked up packages late, but Sandra no longer worried. Montes was a friendly, sociable guy, and they would chat until closing while Montes sorted through his new items. Gradually, Alejandra got to know him better. Somehow, it seemed to her that Montes, with all his virtues, was either lonely or a misunderstood genius. He was so charming, and Sandra couldn't help but notice Montes, a handsome and smart young man, but she didn't make any moves. Guys like Montes usually dated girls from a different circle, as strange as that might sound in the context of the 21st century. No, I'm just an enthusiast, Sandra smiled warmly. By the way, Montes said, suddenly looking embarrassed as he glanced at Sandra and awkwardly smiled, we've known each other for a year now and get along pretty well. Maybe I could meet you after work today. We could go somewhere, hang out. Like a date. Like a date, Sandra repeated automatically and thought for a second. Well, Montes claros, yes, let's do it, she smiled broadly. Seriously? Montes beamed with a wide, satisfied smile. Awesome, I'll meet you after your shift. You don't mind? They exchanged numbers, and as he left, Sandra briefly wondered if she was making a mistake. They were from such different worlds. She had never believed in fairy tales like Cinderella or Beauty and the Beast. A peasant girl couldn't be a match for a prince, for whom the responsibility and well-being of the kingdom were above love and other human attachments. After all, in what fairy tale do they show what happened after the long-awaited happily ever after? The matron at the orphanage always told them, you should marry someone who strives to rise from the bottom and grow together with him. That way, you'll rise to the top together, and even if you part ways, you'll stay there. In other cases, other women, a huge gap, and mutual accusations often appear. Sometimes love is not enough for happiness, my dear girls. But Sandra pulled herself together. She liked Montes, it was foolish to deny it, and he himself had taken the initiative, meaning he saw nothing wrong with dating a simple pickup point worker, spending time together, and even calling it a date. Until the pickup point closed, she couldn't stop thinking about Montes, smiling distractedly and thinking that if she had known she'd have a date today, she would have dressed better. But in the end, before leaving, Sandra took a quick look at her reflection and was satisfied. New jeans, a light blouse, a denim jacket, everything was fine. Montes was already waiting for her. When she turned off the lights, lowered the shutter, and locked the doors, he smiled openly and then laughed. It looks like we share the same stylist. Sandra looked him over. In blue jeans, a white sweater, and a light denim jacket, they really did look similar. Sandra giggled and shook her head. Yeah, indeed. Changed your mind? He asked playfully, and Sandra shook her head. What girl in her right mind would turn down a date with a handsome guy? Montes laughed too. He was carrying the familiar violin case, and Sandra couldn't help but be curious. Were you called to the conservatory today? Yes, Montes drawled. I had to urgently edit a violin part for my thesis, so I quickly put my girlfriend in her new home and rushed to the conservatory. The case is wonderful, by the way. Do you have any preferences on where to go? Maybe this isn't what girls usually do on a first date, but I'm starving. So let's get a large portion of fries with cheese sauce and some kind of burger, okay? Fantastic, Montes laughed. I'm as hungry as a pack of wolves. With this thesis, I always forget to eat. And I've got a nerve-wracking job. I can't seem to get enough to eat, Sandra sighed, but with this job, I can't establish a proper eating routine. I don't like carrying food in containers because then everything smells like food. So, I get by on protein shakes, yogurts, and stuff like that. Great, then let's treat our taste buds together, Montes nodded, and they headed towards the nearest fast food restaurant. Listen, we've known each other for a year, but I don't really know much about you. Except that your name is Alejandra. You can call me Sandra. Sandra? Wonderful, the guy nodded. Maybe you could tell me something about yourself? You seem to know a lot about music. Did you go to a music school or something? Sandra flinched, and to hide it, she zipped up her jacket so she could blame it on the cold if necessary. She wasn't ashamed of her past, her origins, or anything like that, but talking about it was still unpleasant. Moreover, the past had brought her a lot of disappointment, which still lingered. She could have had a beautiful, fulfilling life that she wanted, not without its challenges, but, God knows, Sandra was ready for them. Even now, if she had a chance to fulfill her cherished dream, she would grab it with both hands and never let go. It was unpleasant to admit even to herself, but Sandra was willing to go to great lengths to achieve her goal, not breaking the law but perhaps bending it. She was quite ready to compromise some moral principles for the sake of her cherished goal. I won the National Young Musicians competition back in the day, she told him. Wow, Montes whistled, impressive. I remember our conservatory invited the winners and some particularly memorable participants for training. Wasn't that in your season? They entered the cafeteria, sparing Sandra from having to answer immediately. They placed their order and sat down at a table. Montes promptly got them coffee and hot chocolate to warm up. Once they were settled and had warmed up a bit, he reminded her of his question. It was in my season, Sandra nodded without much enthusiasm. She cleared her throat. I grew up in an orphanage, she finally admitted. Montes raised his eyebrows in surprise, and Sandra quickly continued before he could comment. I got interested in music very early, and they allowed me to pursue it. They sent me to this competition, and I won, but then, Sandra exhaled in frustration, there were some issues with documentation either caused by or related to the headmistress I didn't quite understand. When an orphan participates and wins in such competitions, there is significant sponsorship involved. But my headmistress just didn't bother with it, so here I am, Sandra shrugged, working at a pickup point. But I have a musical education, just without any diplomas or certificates. And here, without a piece of paper, you're nobody. She fell silent awkwardly. Montes nodded understandingly, taking a break to eat. Sandra sipped her hot chocolate, burning her tongue and not knowing what else to say. Then Montes looked up and smiled at her. Listen, if you love good food, I know a great place nearby if you want to meet again. So they went on another date, then another, and another. Sandra was surprised, but Montes wasn't fazed. For him, it didn't seem to matter where Sandra came from, whether she had anyone else, or what kind of family she had, if any at all. He was interested in her, what she did besides work, what books she read, what movies she watched. They went to theaters, strolled in parks. Montes took her to symphony concerts and philharmonics, and watched with a satisfied smile as Alejandra's eyes lit up and she straightened in her seat to better see the conductor's movements. "I'm so glad you love the Philharmonic, operas, and ballets," Montes sighed after one of their dates. "All my few friends are also into music, but for some reason, they don't like attending such events, probably professional deformation." "Oh, but I absolutely adore it," Sandra drawled. She looked wonderfully good in her straight blue cocktail dress, resembling a true princess. "But I don't risk going too often either, afraid of getting oversaturated with art and becoming indifferent." "With your love for beauty, you won't become indifferent," sighed Montes, wrapping an arm around Sandra's shoulders. They talked more and more, and Alejandra no longer understood. Were they just friends or something more? Sure, they went on dates, but what if it was just that for her? Montes never called them dates. He would just suggest meeting up, and Sandra didn't want to jump to conclusions. After all, she was a girl and all that. "By the way," Montes suddenly said, "I have an upcoming concert, one of the reports. Can I hope you'll come?" "Me?" Alejandra looked at Montes in surprise. "Well, I would love to, yes." "Good," Montes nodded, smiling contentedly. He was handsome on his own and completely irresistible when he smiled. "I'll get you tickets close to the stage. Then we plan to hang out with friends afterward, so if you're free, come with us. I'd be happy to have you join." "And your family?" Sandra asked, slightly puzzled. She didn't know why, but it always seemed to her that Montes' family, consisting of musicians and artists, closely followed their son's career. He just shook his head. "They're all busy," he said easily, not seeming upset at all. "This isn't the main concert, just a form of assessment for several disciplines. They'll all come to the main events. And I also wanted to ask." Unexpectedly, his high, pale cheekbones turned a delicate pink. Montes had that special aristocratic paleness, so even a slight blush seemed too bright on his face, giving him away completely. Alejandra couldn't help but be intrigued by his question. "I can introduce you as my girlfriend, right?" Oh. Perhaps she couldn't have managed anything more intellectual for a few seconds, but her mind, always geared towards logic and reason, firmly pushed her lovesick heart aside and made Sandra think. Montes came from a good family. He had a wonderful future, career, and success ahead. What did she have? A tiny apartment, a dubious simple job, enormous ambitions, and a vast field for realizing them. She couldn't jump higher than her head, and Sandra, to her own regret, was somewhere near the limit of her abilities, at least for the next 2 years. On the other hand, Montes knew everything about her, not in detail, but enough to understand her background, could imagine the kind of life she had, and must have known that she wasn't his equal in many ways. But it didn't seem to bother him. Sandra didn't want to be presumptuous, but at that moment, she dared to tell herself, "He must be in love with me." She thought over his peculiar proposal once more and unexpectedly found no reasonable grounds to refuse. It didn't matter how it would end, if it would end at all, as long as they were both happy and content now. And thinking about this, Sandra gave him a playful smile. "Call me your girlfriend?" "Well, you can certainly try, why not?" Montes' face turned confused. His blue eyes scanned her face, trying to decipher what she meant, yes, no, maybe, or unsure. He seemed quite nervous asking her that question. The problem was that they were both nervous. "Is that a yes?" Montes asked uncertainly. Sandra gently smiled at him, took his wrist, and squeezed it firmly. "Yes," she repeated firmly. "Yes?" Montes beamed with a smile and, amidst the cheerful laughter of his newly appointed girlfriend, leaned in to kiss her, again and again. And now he seemed completely happy. Sandra felt the same way. They really started dating, no longer just as good friends, but as a real couple. Now Montes would ask Sandra out on dates. Almost every evening he would walk her home from work, and she often came to his apartment to spend time together. She listened with interest, and with a slight envy she couldn't hide, to his stories about his studies. If she had a day off, she would listen to Montes play the violin. At first, she tried to seem uninterested, but soon enough, she found herself just watching, sitting in a chair she quickly dubbed her own. Montes joked that he brought a girl into his apartment so she would be called his own, not the chair, but he was definitely pleased to see Sandra in his apartment. "Want to try?" he asked one evening after finishing his piece. Sandra's eyes sparkled, and Montes smiled at her. He was happy, truly happy. "I don't know," Alejandra mumbled, rising from the chair, but her fingers already twitched and slightly clenched, like a child reaching for a toy, unsure if they could take it. Montes laughed softly. "Go ahead, take it," he said, handing her the violin. "See, you should hold the violin like this, so your eyes are directly on the fingerboard, and your left hand should be positioned under the lower deck of the violin in such a way that the fingers can fall perpendicularly on the strings, and their tips hit the strings firmly," Sandra interrupted, taking the violin confidently and firmly. Placing it on her shoulder, Sandra swept her mane of dark hair over her back to keep it out of the way and lightly twirled the bow between her fingers. All her movements were confident but smooth and gentle. Leopold Auer, My Violin School, Continuation, Chapter 2, How to Hold the Violin. Don't teach the teacher. "My God, you look at it like you've never looked at me," laughed Montes, watching Sandra examine the violin. Her pupils dilated as people do when they look at someone they truly love. Sandra smiled sadly, her hand trembling slightly, then the bow glided smoothly over the strings. She played like in the poem where the violin played for the deaf, unafraid of making mistakes. After taking a deep breath, Sandra played as she had never played before. For the first time in 5 years, she held a violin in her hands, and even if she could have forgotten something, her hands remembered everything perfectly, each movement, each string, each note. When the first sounds filled the room, Sandra suddenly felt as if sounds appeared around her for the first time, as if she had been deaf all her life, living in a silent world, and suddenly her hearing returned, allowing her to fully enjoy the world, its sounds, colors, and smells. She played the piece with which she won that cherished competition, the victory that had cost her entire past life. A victory that was bitterer than defeat. Sandra could have been in an accident, lost her memory, fallen into a coma, but she would still have played this piece flawlessly, all 40 minutes of it, even on the brink of death. If she had lost her hands, she would have sung every second of the piece. It was what she breathed, what she lived for, an inseparable part of her, like fairies and their wings and tails, like mermaids and their tails. It was her needle in the casket. Break it, and Sandra would cease to exist. Amazing, she thought, how could I deny myself this for so long? Here it is, my life. It was a song of warmth, of the first spring sunbeam, of the nightingale's song, of the gentle dripping, of the warm rain, of love and wonder. The violin in her hands mourned gently about the grand and complex, wept for what would not be, comforted, everything in life is possible. Montes' eyes never left her face, not just listening to what she played, but also reading what she felt. Sandra closed her eyes, her long lashes trembling, her face contorted with such a spasm of tenderness, despair, and love, making it utterly unique. Montes was certain he had never seen and would never see anyone play the violin like his girlfriend Alejandra Poland in these moments. When Sandra finished and slowly lowered the violin, delaying the inevitable moment of parting with the magical instrument, Montes clapped furiously. These were loud, solitary applause in the apartment where only the two of them were present. Sandra flinched as if waking from a dream and awkwardly smiled. Perhaps she had never known more overwhelming ovation. Amazing, said Montes without a hint of exaggeration, seriously, as if contemplating something. Sandra was surprised to notice that tears were welling up in the corners of his eyes. I never thought Vivaldi's The Four Seasons would bring me to tears. Thank you, Sandra murmured, embarrassed. She reverently placed the violin back in its case, looking at it as a parent would look at a sleeping child, and sighed as she closed it. She suddenly hoped that Montes would forget about all this and start talking about something else. But the guy, true to his nature, did otherwise. "With your talent, it's strange that you didn't go further in that competition." Sandra tensed up. They had rarely talked about her orphanage past. Alejandra hoped she had evolved from a timid orphan to a confident young woman, maybe a bit dreamy but hardworking, and didn't want to look back to when she was still a weak ward of an institution for children without parents or parental care. Montes, understandingly, didn't pry into areas she wasn't ready to share, but now he seemed determined to lift the veil of mystery. "I told you, some mix-up with the documents, and everything went down the drain. But the way you play. At such concerts and performances, there are always many experts. They often scout for rising stars. Surely someone must have noticed you?" "Maybe someone did, but I wasn't told," Sandra said, a bit irritated, starting to tire of this conversation. She always tried not to get angry with her boyfriend when he inadvertently touched on a sensitive topic and tried to dig deeper. After all, it was a natural desire to know more about the one you love, and Alejandra restrained her temper. And her silence brought his understanding. Sandra believed there was nothing much to know. She had been nobody and nothing until she left the orphanage. Perhaps she was only the music itself. As a child, she sometimes fantasized that she was not just an ordinary girl but a fairy of music and poetry, or the daughter of Euterpe, the muse of lyrical poetry and music. But she turned out to be what was written in her documents, Alejandra Poland. Montes, however, didn't drop the subject this time. He looked at her thoughtfully, folding his arms across his chest. "With such talent, you should be, at the very least, a descendant of Vivaldi," he said. Sandra sighed wearily. "I have no idea. I don't keep silent about my parents out of spite, but because I truly don't know," she said. "All I have from my mother is a torn piece of a photograph." And Sandra fell silent awkwardly. She had never talked about this secret treasure before, but, after all, Montes had the right to know. "Probably not Vivaldi, but I hope I'm not just the daughter of ordinary drunks. I have a photo of my mother, worn out and of poor quality. She's very young and beautiful in it, not at all like a drunk. I stole this photo when I was just a child from my personal file. After the headmistress refused to send me to the conservatory boarding school, I became wild and uncontrollable. She once reprimanded me in her office because of another scandal, but she was called away, and my folder with my scant biography was on top. I took the opportunity to flip through those papers. I didn't understand much, and there wasn't time to read, but I took the photo that was in the back pocket." Sandra fell silent. Montes was quiet for a while too, then softly, without much hope, asked, "Will you show me?" When Sandra shook her head in refusal, he sighed but didn't say anything. "So that's how it is. How old were you when you won the competition?" 15, Sandra said. Even if she wanted to, she couldn't forget the details of those years, although everything after 15, after that terrible rejection, passed in a blur for her. Montes, like a ray of sunshine, appeared in her life at the age of 22. He probably didn't understand how much she loved him. Montes looked at her in surprise, calculating something. "You must have been preparing for such a competition for a long time. Did you start playing as a baby?" he joked awkwardly. But Alejandra, having learned her boyfriend well, could see how quickly the gears in his head were turning, how he was thinking, and more importantly, how he was planning something. "I was 2 years old when I held my first violin," she suddenly stunned him. Even Montes Claros, from a noble family of musicians, was visibly shocked. He had started music school only at 5. At 5, I was the youngest student in the music club at our orphanage. I gave my first concert at that age. I couldn't speak correctly yet, but I already knew the names of all the orchestral instruments. "Listen, Sandra," he began in a coaxing tone that Sandra knew well. Montes had thought of something, and now, whatever she said or answered, he would achieve his goal. It was the same tactic he used to persuade her to move in with him. Sometimes, some masters at our conservatory hold auditions that anyone can attend, even without a musical education. I know about that, she interrupted him, and I know it's all about connections. Sandra smiled sourly. Do you think I haven't tried everything on the way? All that's left is sleeping around, she joked crudely and rudely, but Montes ignored her comment. The master I've been studying with since childhood, Senor Toledano, is a family friend. I'm sure he would listen to you and fall in love with your playing. You could take lessons from him until the new academic year, and then he could help you get into the conservatory under his patronage. What do you think? Sandra's eyes widened, and although Montes was offering her the chance of a lifetime, her first reaction was, Montes, no. She wasn't afraid of the audition, but of the fact that her castle of pink clouds suddenly became quite real and close, and most of all, that it was Montes doing this for her, a man she had already grown deeply attached to, feeling strong emotions for. Sometimes, doubts would creep into Sandra's mind about whether he needed her. But Montes mercifully ignored such bouts of insecurity, and Sandra allowed herself to enjoy how their relationship was unfolding. But this was something more. Montes was offering her something worth her entire life, a second chance, 1 in 1,000. Yet, upon hearing her refusal, Montes simply beamed with a satisfied, toothy smile. Montes, yes, he declared, and before she could voice her worried refusals and objections, he pulled Sandra to him for a kiss. A couple of days later, he introduced Sandra to Senor Toledano, a 73-year-old violin and music theory teacher who was the godfather of Montes' uncle. Montes initially went with her, but Senor Toledano asked him to leave. Montes was surprised to note that Sandra wasn't anxious or nervous at all. She greeted and introduced herself calmly, looking around the auditorium with such reverent adoration and awe as if an ancient saint had entered a modern, magnificent temple. Montes smiled restrainedly. In a long, strict blue dress in the style of Kate Middleton, with her hair up, she looked more beautiful and elegant than ever. Alejandra's audition lasted about an hour and a half. At first, it was quiet, then muffled sounds of the violin were heard. The conservatory auditoriums were soundproof, so Montes couldn't hear what his girlfriend was playing, but at some point, he found himself tapping the rhythm of the Four Seasons. For some reason, he wasn't worried at all. Sandra's calmness and confidence had been transferred to him, and Montes was now sure that everything would go wonderfully. When he was allowed to enter, he saw Alejandra smiling slightly. Senor Toledano looked at him without showing much emotion, but Montes noticed the silent astonishment in the teacher's eyes. Montes, you have found a real diamond, Senor Toledano said reservedly. I never thought that people with such talent still existed outside these walls. Yes, of course, there are minor mistakes in posture, finger positioning, a bit of stiffness, but I suppose that's due to a long absence from practice. Probably, Alejandra said calmly. When I picked up the violin, I thought my fingers were frozen sticks. And then everything will start to hurt, nodded Senor Toledano. Your theoretical knowledge is amazing, and if you agree, Alejandra, we'll start preparing, and next year you can join us. That I can promise you for sure. Alejandra's fingers twitched slightly, gently clenching with excitement. She swallowed nervously. Damn. Here it was, her lifelong dream, her castle in the air. She was no longer just approaching it, no longer just realizing it was real, as it was when she was preparing for the audition. She was on the threshold of this castle, the dream was almost in her hands. And Sandra intended to grab it and hold on tight. There was just one detail that needed clarification. Unfortunately, Sandra couldn't completely forget about the real world. The cost, she asked rather businesslike, seeing no point in hesitating or being shy. Such individual courses were significantly cheaper but still required payment. The master would take on a student, nurture them, and they would enter the conservatory by recommendation. If the student successfully graduated, the master would receive a certain premium and reward. However, the actual process of nurturing was not covered by the conservatory, and these courses were conducted at the teacher's own rate. Senor Toledano opened his mouth to answer, but Montes quickly but gently interjected. "I'll take care of it," he said firmly. Alejandra opened her mouth, ready to object, feeling increasingly uncomfortable, but Montes looked at her warningly and shook his head. "I'm following etiquette. I invited you, so I pay. And no objections." Sandra tried a few more times to hint that she was uncomfortable accepting such expensive gifts, but Montes, happy with her success, didn't listen, and Sandra gave in. In June, Montes finished his studies, and after a short break, Señor Toledano set to work on polishing the diamond that Montes had brought to the institute. The young man laughed, saying that Señor Toledano couldn't wait to work with Sandra himself. "He may not show it, but he's absolutely thrilled with you," Montes confided, and Sandra laughed, pleased. After overcoming her initial anxiety and doubts, she finally immersed herself in her magical new world with pleasure. Their relationship also progressed. Almost immediately after graduation, they moved in together. Montes had suggested moving in earlier, but Sandra felt he needed peace and personal space before graduating from the conservatory, so they agreed to move in at the end of June. Montes initially grumbled, but later was grateful. He was so overwhelmed with exams, his thesis, and the concert that he couldn't have adjusted calmly to having his girlfriend in his apartment, getting used to not living alone. Moving in together was a serious decision, an important step in their relationship, so it was crucial to maintain their relationship, feelings, and love during such a challenging time. The only remaining issue was Alejandra meeting the Claros family. Sandra, who had not just resigned herself but truly believed in Montes' serious intentions, was mentally preparing for this meeting and was not opposed to it. Montes honestly admitted that he had already told his family about Sandra, and Señor Toledano had mentioned that he was working with Montes' talented girlfriend. However, his family were teachers and sought-after masters, and during the period when Montes had exams and final concerts, his parents were busy with their own students. The busy schedule of the Claros family members did not yet allow for a general introduction. However, Montes was confident that once things settled down, he would indeed introduce his girlfriend to his family. "I'll probably end up marrying you without even noticing," Sandra joked. "I'll wake up one day, and we'll have been married for 10 years with 2 kids. "Don't worry," Montes smiled, "you'll definitely notice it all." One way or another, everything happened just as Montes had planned. In early July, he proudly announced that they were invited for dinner and asked Sandra not to worry. But of course, Alejandra immediately started to worry. He had a wealthy, highly intelligent family, and Alejandra was anxious. They probably wouldn't like her, someone without lineage, possibly the child of some homeless people or alcoholics. And yet, there was that photograph of her mother. Montes was calm and confident, and his confidence was contagious. He wasn't worried at all because he knew he loved Sandra. Life without her was difficult because she was everything he had ever wanted in another person, someone with true depth, sardonic humor, and fierce intelligence. He also knew Sandra loved him just as much. This girl had high standards, so at least Montes had a chance that being with him brought her satisfaction. One way or another, this meeting had to happen. "I'm sure they'll love you," Montes said, "just as much as I do." "I really hope so," Sandra murmured. The Claros family, as expected, lived in a large mansion outside the city. Well, lived wasn't the most accurate term, rather, they gathered there occasionally. Each had a more mobile residence in the city since commuting through traffic for important work during the season was impractical. There were precedents where the senior members of the Claros family even stayed overnight at the conservatory during the busiest exam periods. The family wasn't very large: mother and father, Pedra and Leonardo. Besides Pedra and Leonardo, Alejandra was also to meet Pedra's mother, Señora Carlita, who, due to her age, had left her career as an opera singer and moved to teaching vocals, and lived with her daughter and son-in-law. Carlita's husband, Señor Santiago, was probably the only family member who wasn't a musician, singer, or someone with a musical education. He was a historian. Montes also mentioned that his uncle Arturo and his godfather Señor Toledano might come. Before the visit, Sandra took 2 valerian tablets, and by the time they arrived, they had taken effect, and she felt calmer. Contrary to expectations, they weren't greeted in the hall like in all those movies about wealthy families. They arrived to find Leonardo and Senor Santiago smoking on the veranda. When they approached, the men smiled warmly at them. "Well, hello, young people," said Senor Santiago, apparently as the eldest family member, taking the first word. "How was the journey? Did you have a good trip?" "Good evening, Grandpa, Dad," Montes nodded. "The journey was fine, thank you." "Alejandra," he put his arm around his companion's waist, "this is my grandfather and father, Senor Santiago and Leonardo. This is Alejandra, my girlfriend." "Good evening," Alejandra nodded, managing her slight nervousness. "Nice to meet you." She was given a light, appraising look, but it wasn't intrusive. Sandra raised her chin slightly, knowing she looked stunning that evening. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, and she wore a long, dark green dress with a black belt at the waist, a neat light makeup without bright tones, and her feet were adorned in black suede shoes with straps. Sandra wasn't offended by the evaluating glances. Any parents would look at their child's partner like that, as appearance often reveals a lot about a person. She had prepared herself for being closely watched and was even grateful for the strict etiquette and behavior training she received in the orphanage. "We are also pleased to meet you, Alejandra," Leonardo nodded. "Finally, our boy has brought his fiancé home." "Fiancé," Montes repeated dreamily. Sandra raised an eyebrow, and he laughed awkwardly. "Careful, you might scare away my fiancé," said Montes, holding Sandra tightly, who laughed awkwardly. They stayed on the veranda for a while longer. The men talked, discussing premieres, work, and amusing stories from the workplace. Sandra felt her tongue glued to her palate, but she eagerly and adoringly listened to every word. Judging by their reactions, her shining eyes did not go unnoticed. They discussed the possible production of the ballet The Pharaoh's Daughter, and Montes held Alejandra by the waist, gently stroking her with his fingertips. "The Pharaoh's Daughter," Sandra repeated, leaning forward involuntarily. "Will you play the Pharaoh?" "And Lord Wilson," Leonardo nodded. "I want to experiment with live music in the ballet and am trying to convince Montes to be the director, but he is resisting for some reason." "It would be an amazing project," Sandra agreed, relaxing. "Montes has a way of feeling the characters, which is very important for a director." "Everything would go like clockwork." "Absolutely," Leonardo laughed. Senor Santiago rolled his eyes wearily. "Oh God, it seems this obsessed musical family will soon have another musician. At least Arturo should marry a physicist or chemist, honestly." Everyone laughed. They went into the house, and there Alejandra was introduced to Montes' mother and grandmother. Pedra gave her a more critical look than her husband and father, but was overall welcoming. To Alejandra's great relief, Pedra smiled warmly and greeted her, while Senora Carlita, after mutual introductions, immediately asked what kind of wine Alejandra drank. On the low table in the living room where the family had gathered, there were already 2 bottles of wine and beautiful tall glasses. "I don't drink," Sandra said shyly. Montes barely held back a snort. "Of course, she doesn't drink, a person who could easily drink without getting drunk. But what girl would reveal all her capabilities to her boyfriend's parents during their first meeting?" Senora Carlita just snorted. "That's nonsense. A glass of good wine never hurt anyone. Trust me, dear, as an experienced singer, no wine, no voice. That's how it is. So, while the table is being set, I suggest a light aperitif." Sandra stifled a short laugh. My God, they really do have staff in the house, she thought. Before dinner, they chatted a bit. Sandra was asked about her job, how her lessons with Senor Toledano were going, what kind of music she was studying, and then the conversation slowly shifted to more distant and calm topics. During dinner, there was little conversation, mostly about household matters, premieres, and work trips. Montes was asked about his plans, where he intended to work after finishing his studies. "And you, Alejandra, are you also going to study at the conservatory?" Pedra asked. They apparently knew her story about not having parents and tactfully avoided that topic. Yes, I'll be applying in August, Sandra nodded, after my lessons with Senor Toledano. Which department? Musical and instrumental arts, orchestral string instruments, violin. Good choice, Leonardo nodded. I really like the sound of the violin, added Senor Santiago, one of my favorite instruments. Sandra has real talent, said Senor Toledano, and Sandra blushed deeply. It feels like she was born with the instrument in her hands. Maybe instead of a rattle, they gave you a violin? Or in a past life, I was Antonio Vivaldi, declared Sandra, and everyone laughed. Sandra relaxed after a glass of wine and was no longer as nervous. She realized that the family members had many things to do, and they rarely met together for dinner, once a week, and during this time, they had news to discuss. At some point, Montes suggested showing Sandra around the house. They stepped outside. Sandra exhaled. Montes hugged her shoulders, kissing her temple. Well, how are you? Well, my hands weren't shaking too much, and I'm not worried anymore, Sandra admitted honestly, smiling. You were charming, Montes reassured her. They went up to the second floor, turned into a corridor, and Sandra, with surprise, saw that it was something like a gallery, with large genuine paintings hanging on the walls. Everything's fine, don't worry, he added. The first impression was definitely good, and as they get to know you better, they'll see what a wonderful person you are and love you just like I do. But I hope you like my family too. Did you feel comfortable? I was nervous, but I wasn't uncomfortable, Sandra said. Your family is very intelligent, very polite. I really enjoyed talking with them. And by the way, she added playfully, squinting at Montes, fiancé? Montes blushed charmingly. In our family, everything is always serious, he tried to say as cheerfully as possible. But Sandra was surprised to see that he was genuinely embarrassed about the word fiancé in relation to her, taking it quite seriously. But, Sandra, we're not pressured, don't worry, it's just. I understand, it's all good, Sandra smiled, feeling a strange excitement and joy deep inside at the thought that Montes seriously considered her as his fiancé. She had never thought she would be glad that her boyfriend, whom she had been dating for just over 6 months, was considering a serious relationship. As you said, it would be hard not to notice when you get married. Montes laughed awkwardly. And Sandra, who had been examining portraits of composers and members of the Claros family, suddenly froze. On 2 opposite walls were portraits of family members and famous composers. Montes was saying something about his family when Sandra felt as if she had been doused with cold water. Her gaze stopped on a familiar face. Sandra, what's wrong? He asked worriedly. She didn't respond. She stared at the woman in one of the portraits. The dark hair was styled elegantly, and she was depicted in a heavy burgundy dress with a shallow neckline adorned with a pearl necklace. The stately fresh brunette was very tall, with dark eyes, a lovely, gentle face, and perfect features. Sandra instinctively leaned forward, lightly touching the portrait with her fingers, and realized it wasn't a photograph or a photo made to look like a portrait, but an actual portrait. Who is this? One of your relatives? Sandra asked in a barely audible voice, although she already knew the answer. Sandra knew every inch of that face, every detail of that portrait. It was her mother, the woman Alejandra had only seen in a small, worn photograph. And what was her image doing here? Could it be that her mother was a musician, an opera singer, or a ballerina? Or was she a claros, a relative of Montes? Could they be related? Montes, however, looked at the portrait without much expression. My mother's greatest idol in the entire musical world is Martina Rivera, a famous pianist who became well known as a child, performing in competitions from the age of 5. She came from a fairly poor family. Martina didn't have a father, but she managed to rise from the very bottom. For my mother, she is a model of hard work and perseverance. She wrote music for several famous ballets and textbooks on piano teaching. Montes smirked slightly and shook his head. You don't know her? How is that possible? You're planning to enter the conservatory, Sandra. Sandra's nerves gave way. The taut string of misunderstanding, tension, fear of the evening, and now this, all snapped in an instant, and tears streamed from her eyes. Unable to find the strength to explain anything, she ran down the stairs and out of the house, muttering an awkward farewell to Senora Carlita, who had come out of the dining room to call Montes and Sandra back. Alejandra knew she was being rude and improper, but the tension inside her didn't allow her to stay and explain everything. She just ran away. What happened? Carlita asked, raising an eyebrow, as her grandson quickly ran down the stairs to catch Sandra. But the girl had already jumped into a taxi that whisked her away from the house. Damn it, Montes shouted loudly, bewildered and anxious. Watch your language, Pedro automatically scolded him, coming out of the dining room with the rest of the family. What happened? I think I upset Sandra, Montes said uncertainly. Sandra's reaction puzzled him. She was not the type to get offended, run away, and ignore solving the problem. She preferred to sit down and talk, to address issues right then and there, certainly not to run off in tears. He explained what had happened, slightly embarrassed. Said Senor Toledano, Alejandra doesn't seem like a girl who would get upset and run away in tears so easily. I didn't mean to upset her. She probably just got too nervous, that's all. That's it. And then cried over a trifle, Pedro suggested, patting her son on the shoulder. Meeting the family of a young man is a serious step, and her nerves probably gave out. Tomorrow, go and apologize to her. The next day, Montes entered their apartment as if walking into a minefield. He considered Sandra the rightful mistress of their little nest and didn't want to assert himself as this is my home, I'm the master here. Moreover, he was very worried that she might not be home at all, unsure how deeply he had upset her. But Sandra was home, sitting in the chair she had claimed long ago, thoughtfully looking at a photograph in her hands. Hi, Montes said uncertainly, hiding behind a bouquet of orchids like a shield. Sandra flinched, as if she hadn't heard him come in, and stared at Montes. I'm here to apologize. No, you should forgive me, Montes, Sandra said quietly. I behaved so badly yesterday. I'm very ashamed of myself, and before your family. Now, as a fiancé, I certainly haven't made a good impression. Come on, Montes exhaled with relief, coming closer and placing the bouquet on the table. He squatted down in front of Sandra. My mom, during her first meeting with my grandparents, was so nervous that she drank too much wine. They still joke about it to this day. So, no one is judging you. Mom said I should invite you for another meeting. They'll be happy to see you again. Montes paused, gently stroking Sandra's knees with his fingers. But still, what happened, dear? Sandra remained silent for a while, looking at the photograph in her hands, and then turned it towards Montes. My mother, she said simply, that woman in your portrait, Martina Rivera, that's my mother. Montes, like in a movie, opened his mouth, then closed it again and opened it once more, staying silent for a few minutes, shifting his gaze from the photograph to Sandra's face, seeing or thinking he saw the obvious resemblance. Martina in the photograph was slightly older than Sandra, and her eyes were dark, But, Sandra, I don't even know, Montes said awkwardly. He didn't want to dismiss Sandra's idea as foolish right away, and he had the photograph in his hands. However, it was hard to believe just like that. Martina Rivera had no children. Yes, I know, Sandra nodded patiently. I know that officially she had no children, but I also know that I took this photograph from the back pocket of my personal file in the orphanage. Maybe this is all some big joke, or maybe. They both thought about the incredible possibility, about some big secret. For Montes, this changed nothing, it seemed like just a fun adventure, but it was important because it was important to Sandra, more important than anything else. What if it turned out to be true, and she felt more equal because of it? Montes had never thought about it himself, but he understood that Alejandra was somewhat embarrassed by her uncertain origins. The only thing he could do was convince her of his love. I spent the whole night searching the internet, I hardly slept, Alejandra sighed, and Montes noticed her red eyes and how tired she looked. Of course, there's no information about me as Martina's daughter, but... Sandra nervously wrung her hands. The first charitable donation made by Pablo, Martina's mother, was to my orphanage. I know they made many donations after that. But your orphanage was the first. Montes understood her train of thought. Let's rest today, think everything over, browse the internet together, and tomorrow we'll go to my parents. Maybe they can shed some light. Montes' parents also approached Sandra's theory with some skepticism. Nevertheless, they all decided to investigate further. Senora Carlita wrote to a former colleague who had left the music industry to work in the archives. They decided to start there and then talk to the headmistress of the orphanage. Thankfully, she was still in her position. Actually, there isn't much information, said Senora Carlita. She was quite embarrassed to talk about all this, especially in Alejandra's presence, but the matter was serious. You were registered at the orphanage on the day marked as your birthday. It seems you were just abandoned, Carlita said awkwardly. But that's about it, no notes or anything, just a newborn in a carrier. You were wrapped in a warm blanket, but it had no tags or labels to identify it. The only thing that puzzled my former colleague was the time of registration. Usually, they write the time when the child was found, and yours was recorded at 12:22 p.m. Middle of the day, Pedro understood, very strange time to abandon a child. Makes you wonder if the baby was really abandoned or not. Overall, there's nothing more interesting, except that Pablo Rivera indeed made the first donation to this orphanage. There were several large donations after that, especially a significant one around the time Alejandra participated in that music competition. It still could be a coincidence, Senor Santiago argued uncertainly. After all, if your headmistress, what's her name, Senora Claudia, was hiding your origins for some reason, then either Pablo or Martina themselves would have had to finance it somehow. Why donate directly to the orphanage if they could hand over a lump sum privately? Senora Claudia cares deeply for the children, Alejandra countered. She has some personal drama, and although she's a rather strict woman, she genuinely cares about the children. Our orphanage was one of the best, and it truly was. So maybe she received some money personally and invested some of it back into the orphanage. Well, then there's no choice, Leonardo sighed. We'll go and talk to her in person. Senora Claudia received the Claros couple and Sandra with them reservedly, with a strained smile. Initially, she denied everything, but after being presented with a few large sums of cash, she exhaled, and Alejandra knew she was about to learn the truth. Senora Claudia didn't rush and started from the beginning. I took my position very young, and this orphanage needed major renovation and improvements, all of which required money, she said sparingly, counting the money. Very few people donate enough money to both pay the staff and improve conditions for the children. Additionally, I had to arrange my own life, education, housing, supporting my parents. When you are torn between moral codes and your responsibilities, it doesn't seem so bad to forge a few checks and take some money. And then Pablo appeared. Claudia's face twitched slightly. Her daughter, a rising star, got pregnant by a fellow student and intended to be a mother instead of a musician. Senora Claudia could not allow that. Martina gave birth to a small premature girl, and Pablo brought her here and told us to make sure no one ever knew Martina had a child. Senora Claudia looked Sandra straight in the eye. We did just that. Martina herself believed that her daughter was dead. She was told the baby didn't survive childbirth. The photograph ended up with us by chance, and I decided to keep it just in case. When Alejandra started to shine in competitions, Pablo strictly forbade us from encouraging it, which is why you didn't go anywhere after your big win. My relatives' wealth extinguished me because I was unwanted? Sandra whispered, and Montes hugged her tighter, fearing she might collapse. And then you blackmailed Pablo Rivera all her life, Pedro said harshly. Senora Claudia didn't respond, but Pedro didn't need an answer. The news reported that Senora Pablo died of a heart attack caused by years of stress. Martina outlived her mother by a short time. The childbirth and subsequent depression from losing her daughter, the inability to have another child, and her mother's death broke her down. She died of a heart attack 2 years later. That's the price of your silence. Not such a high price, Senora Claudia said dryly. 2 lives against hundreds of well-cared-for orphans, our staff having good stable incomes. If I had to, I'd do it again. No doubt, Leonardo said coldly, turning and leaving the office first. Pedro followed her husband, and Montes, hugging the bewildered, trembling Sandra by the shoulders, led her out after his parents. Later, the Claros family offered to make a public statement and conduct a biological relationship test, but Sandra initially refused. She felt at peace knowing who her mother was, the great pianist of her time. The pain from realizing that neither Alejandra nor Martina ever knew each other, that Sandra remained a dead baby to her mother and Martina a distant guiding star to her, was immense. But breathing became easier, knowing she was no longer just an orphan without a name. Eventually, Senor Toledano convinced her to do the DNA test. Martina had never been married, and she had left her entire estate to the conservatory where she once studied, the Madrid Royal Conservatory, the same place where her daughter now studied. The test confirmed what Sandra and the Montes family already knew, but the news caused a sensation in society, and Sandra's entry into the conservatory was widely covered in the press and social media. The secret daughter of a famous pianist on the steps of her great-mother's conservatory. Senora Rivera's surviving daughter follows in her dynasty's footsteps. Sandra dived into it all headfirst, now able to pay for herself and study. It came at the cost of a painful, complicated past, but it was something Sandra could live with. Moreover, Montes was always there, her gentle, sensitive partner, initially her lover, then her fiancé, and by the end of her second year of study, her husband. He was always there, supporting her and continuing to love her through her studies, her first tours, and her phenomenal successes. Montes understood that his young wife was much more talented than he was, but for him, as before, it didn't matter. The only thing that changed was that his family became much more favorable towards Sandra. Their initial doubts vanished. Sandra, too, found it easier, as she was now not just their son's and grandson's girlfriend, but the daughter of a famous pianist. Knowing this information made her feel more equal in the tight-knit musical community. After her studies, Alejandra started giving concerts. Montes often traveled with her, though he admitted that he was a bit jealous, not envious, but jealous of his young wife's success. He loved Sandra, truly loved her, and rejoiced in her success. But success inevitably stole his wife away from him. Montes didn't hinder her, he supported her but still dreamed of a couple of years when they would belong only to each other, preferably somewhere in the Alps or Switzerland. And his wish, like his desire 3 years ago to introduce Alejandra to his family, came true, even better than he could have imagined. They were sitting in the kitchen of a rented apartment in Valencia, where they had come with a ballet featuring Martina Rivera's music. Alejandra Claros, her daughter, was the lead violinist, and the conductor was Montes Claros, Alejandra's husband. Truth be told, Leonardo also danced in this ballet, The Pharaoh's Daughter, but in the last year, he had moved more towards teaching, while the young couple continued to conquer the stage. Then there are tours in Germany, a performance in Paris. Montes listed their plans. Sandra nodded mechanically, feeling a strange sensation all evening. And then there will be a break, and a week before Christmas, we can go somewhere to relax. After the holidays, we have a busy schedule. We never really had a proper honeymoon. We'll have to clear the schedule significantly after the holidays, Sandra suddenly said. Why? Montes asked in surprise. What about your success, your victories? Did something happen? Something did happen, Sandra nodded, looking Montes in the eyes. In about 7 months, there will be another Claros in our family, and although classical music is beneficial for children, the workload will be contraindicated for me. I'm pregnant, Montes. Montes beamed with a broad smile, and, rushing to Alejandra, laughing, he lifted her from her seat and twirled her around. They spun around the kitchen, laughing, kissing, and feeling utterly happy. And now Sandra no longer doubted that everything would work out for them, just as Montes never doubted it back then. After all, she had the portrait of her mother, her example, before her eyes. And if Martina didn't succeed, her daughter was determined to make it. To succeed and be happy for both of them.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.